Hello. Hi, my name is Shreya Chatterjee, and I'm Head of Research Initiatives here at the Centre. And I'm really, really pleased to welcome all of you to the Centre today, both in person and online. Femi tells me that we're also live. Great. So a lot of you are familiar with the structure of these talks. So I'm just going to introduce our speaker and the topic today. And it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce somebody who's from the home team. Martin Myrone is Head of Research Support and Pathways at the Paul Mellon Centre. Before joining the Centre in 2020, Martin spent over 20 years in curatorial roles at Tate in London. His many exhibitions at Tate Britain have included Gothic Nightmares 2006, John Martin 2011, William Blake 2019, and Hogarth in Europe 2021. And I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with some of these exhibitions as well. So his research and publications have focused on 18th and 19th century British art, with a special interest in artistic identity and artists' labour, class, cultural opportunity, and gender. His many published works include Bodybuilding, Reforming Masculinities in British Art 1750 to 1810, and Making the Modern Artist, Culture, Class, and Art Educational Opportunity in Romantic Britain, published in 2020, both published by the Paul Mellon Centre. So today, Martin will be talking about one of the most remarkable but forgotten works of British art of any era. So we're setting this up. The Christian Inhabitants of Parga Preparing to Emigrate, 1822, by the brothers George and James Foggo. Before handing over to Martin, I will just say that the talk will last for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then after that we'll have time for questions both from the room, but also for those of you online. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and then for everyone here, we will have a drinks reception next door. Sorry about those of us joining online. Thank you, and over to Martin.
Okay, thank you very much, Shreya, and thank you for coming out on a very pleasant, cold spring evening. It's very nice to see so many people here. I'm sure lots of people joining online. This may be one of the kind of larger audiences for this picture in its history, as I'll go on to describe. My talk concerns a single painting, one which no longer exists, Parga, by the brothers James and George Foggo. The picture was first exhibited publicly in London at a commercial gallery in 1822 and shipped over to Paris in 1839 to be shown there. It featured at the London International Exhibition in 1862, but in the end sold cheaply at auction after both brothers were dead and was lost from sight in 1870. It was reproduced, we might assume relatively accurately, in a lithograph produced by the brothers at an uncertain date but before 1842, and that's what I'm going to be showing throughout the talk. We know from the inscription on the print and other sources that it was 16 feet high and 26 feet long. So that's 4.8 meters high and about 8 meters long. For those of you in the room, the same height, if not slightly higher than the room that we're in, and extending to about 3/4 of the length of the room. For those not in the room, here are some figures to give a sense of scale. I don't know who these people are. They sort of live in PowerPoint, and they've been called to the service just to give an idea. I mean, you'll see that it's a big picture, and it's over life-size figures in the foreground, certainly. I undertake this task of historical recovery or resurrection with several aims in view. First, there are historical topics and questions which this work helps illuminate about the status of history painting during a moment which has remained unexplored by art historians, about models of artistic identity and the potential for collaborative practice, and about a global history of liberal revolutions and Britain's informal empire. It points to a history of radical and liberal history painting from the 1820s in Britain, which is yet really to be written, although Colin Trott has already written, in effect, its final chapter, with his study of the Victorian painter Ford Madox Brown, where the brothers Foggo are cast as progenitors of Brown's belief in the union of painting reform and democratic government. Beyond that, there are historiographical issues about what constitutes so-called Romanticism in art, what are the proper objects of attention, how the Romantic relates to modernity, and specifically to the advent of consumer culture, which leads in turn to a confrontation, a confrontation with art historical doxa. Doxa being beliefs which are so embedded that they don't need stating. In this case, that art history, even when modulated or revised as interdisciplinary or politically progressive, remains heavily constrained by its commitment to the visual, and therefore the already visible, and to notions of quality and aesthetic pleasure. And finally, a rather more abstract issue. How do we conceive the relationship between the living and the dead in a modernity characterized by transactionalism? My prompts for these final reflections are thoughts from Bourdieu on the potential of historical sociology for the resurrection of dead possibilities, and from Adorno and Horkheimer on the disturbed relationship with the dead, which characterizes modernity. I'll be coming back. These are kind of rather grandiose themes, and I'll be returning to these points at the end. But I'll be starting here in Marks and Spencer's on Oxford Street. This is a building many of you will know. Some of those in the room may even have walked past it this afternoon. It's just 5 minutes or so from Bedford Square. And some of you will have noted that the rather striking black facade, designed in the 1930s and intended as a modular template for all Marks and Spencers to follow, is surmounted by a neon sign declaring the Pantheon, because it is built on the site of the Pantheon, first erected as a relatively classy entertainment venue in the 1770s and rebuilt after a fire in the 1830s as a shopping bazaar and gallery, featuring, it appears, the display of artworks from the outset. The Pantheon is the setting of this fashion plate from 1834. It became, over the next couple of decades, a kind of graveyard for supersized paintings by contemporary British artists, including notably Haydn, whose Raising of Lazarus was noted as a perennial feature, and from 1852 it became the home of the Foggos' Parga and several other of their works. In fact, for several years after, the brothers managed the gallery here as an, quote, independent refuge of the arts, independent, that is, from the state or Royal Academy. Free to enter, the gallery nonetheless had little success. While the novelist Henry James remembered the Pantheon fondly as, quote, a place of fine Rococo traditions, a bazaar, an exhibition, an opportunity at the end of long walks for the consumption of buns and ginger beer, the journalist George Augustus Sala was more typically noted it as a, quote again, queer picture gallery where works by 20th-rate masters have been quietly accumulating smoke and dust for some score years. 20th rate, not just second rate, not even third rate, 20th-rate masters. The gallery closed in 1867 and was turned over to office space. The pictures, including Parga, were dispersed, and it seems quite certain that the Foggos' paintings shared the fate of so many large pictures from this era, cut down into more saleable portions or rolled up and forgotten and left to rot. And in truth, we can't dramatize this as a fall from grace. The picture, at best, enjoyed a mixed reputation from the outset. Its subject may not be self-evident. What we see is a multitude of figures and a mix of unfamiliar costumes. Some are obviously intended as dead, some definitely animated, others apparently poised between these states. To the right, a complex grouping of figures handling a heavy-looking dead body. A pyre can be glimpsed behind them. Below are clustered mustachioed and bearded figures huddling together and a steeply foreshortened naked man. At the center, distinctly priestly figures stand on stone steps. To the left, a dense crowd, and across the foreground, a naked figure outstretched on a length of cloth, men in turbans and cloaks, a body being raised out of a grave. Among the smaller details, we see an awkwardly over-intimate trio of a girl, a heavily bearded elder, and a man wearing a fez and turban combination. It is only with some effort that we notice the figures in the distance, standing on the steps of a church, including some in Western European military costume. The subject should have been more immediately legible to viewers in the 19th century just on the basis of the published titles. Variously, the representation of the people of Parga burning their dead, destruction of Parga, the Greeks, the Great Picture, and grand historical painting of the evacuation of Parga. Parga was a speck within the massive extent of the Ottoman Empire, circled in red here. And that's Corfu. The island of Corfu is just to the kind of left and slightly above the town of Parga on the coast of Greece. But it had resisted Ottoman rule through the 18th century, a possession of Venice, together with the nearby islands. During the Napoleonic Wars, these Venetian territories were conceded to the Ottoman Empire, but Parga continued to resist the efforts of the Ottoman-aligned Albanian Ali Pasha to take the town with the intervention of, at various points, the Russians, the French, and then in 1814, the British, whom the Pargaots welcomed as their protectors. British troops were posted in the town, but while the Congress of Vienna in 1815 imposed a British protectorate on the nearby islands, the mainland harbours, including Parga, were excluded, slightly mysteriously. In June 1819, Britain came to a financial settlement with Ali Pasha, selling out Parga for £142,000, significantly less than its estimated value. Thus abandoned, the entire population of 5,000 migrated, sailing over to Corfu. Attempting to defend the move from a deluge of criticism, Lord Castlereagh, Foreign Minister, clarified in Parliament, and I quote, "We had never delivered Parga up to the Turks. All we agreed to was to withdraw our troops from the town and leave the inhabitants to themselves." The account provided by the exiled Italian radical Ugo Foscolo in the Edinburgh Review of October 1819 was incendiary, helping fuel the flame which became what I was taught to know as the Greek War of Independence, but which, since the bicentenary of 2021, is more generally dubbed the Greek Revolution, a move which aligns it with the liberal revolutions which arose globally in the 1820s in Brazil, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Russia, and elsewhere. Foscolo cast the Pargaots as the inheritors of Hellenic dignity and a Christian barrier against the advance of the barbaric Turks, sold out in the most unfeeling way by self-interested British politicians. Crucially, Fosco focused sensationally on the reported actions of the Pargaots in disinterring and burning the remains of their ancestors, before the ground these rested in were taken over by Ali Pasha and his Muslim forces. It is precisely this that the Foggos deal with so expansively in their picture, making the details of their scene clear in a pamphlet published to accompany the original exhibition of the picture. So, to the right, as bodies are raised up onto the pyre, we note a newly married couple. On the right in the centre there, still wearing, the bride still wearing the marriage veil. They're sort of cowering to the right, about halfway down to the right edge. There. The central group are priests with the proto-papa having read the church service over the dead, while another priest, entreats a mother who had brought her innocent babe to receive the blessings of the gospel to withdraw from the pile. The foreground details include the body of a maiden decked with flowers and the body of a young warrior, once his country's hope. The trio left of centre includes Hamed Bey, a Turkish agent who endeavours, with the sight of gold, which is in his palm, to tempt an old man who accompanies his daughter, attempting to get the man to sell his daughter to, or hand over his daughter for money. The figures in the background are identified as a deputation of Pargaots confronting the British governor, near the church. There's the British governor, warning him that if a single Muslim should enter the town, they would kill their own wives and children. So you see there's a sword drawn, but the guy with the sword is looking back at the British saying, well, I'm going to kill my wife and children if the anti-Pashas troops come here. With this textual elaboration, we are left with the certainty that the Pargaiots are variously pious and noble, severe in their rejection of Islam, physically beautiful and athletic, invulnerable to material temptations, and were leading good and happy lives, very suddenly interrupted. They are the good guys. The British, by contrast, are the bad guys. Obviously, the narrative is set out in quite spectacularly morbid form, and there was a contrast between the Foggo's treatment of the theme and the other representations that appeared over the next decade. In the French painter Calais' picture of 1827, the British look pretty indifferent. That's up there on the top left. But then there is none of the gruesome spectacle that the Foggos provide. In a picture by Hares, the cremation of the ancestors is only gently implied by the smoke which rises over the town. And there is a dramatic contrast with other pictures of or later pictures of the Greek Revolution, such as this work by Eastlake, where the British, this time, are arriving in the sailing ships to the left to save the day after the massacre on Chios. So here are the goodly Greeks, and there are the British coming to save them. Now, it was, and I think it's pretty obvious, Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, exhibited in London in 1820, that formed a specific point of reference for the Foggo's canvas. It was similarly politically controversial, turning on the incompetence or indifference of the establishment. And there was simply a matter of the scale and over life size, the scale and the size of the image, with multitudes of figures involved and the opportunities presented in the subject matter to represent them nude or partly clothed, posed heroically or especially in suffering, poised on the edge of death or already deceased. Like Géricault, the Foggos are mobilizing elements of Gothic sensationalism. These last points are especially important. Géricault's picture and the Foggo's uncelebrated effort in a similar vein can be situated in an attempt to politicize ambitious art in relation to the liberal radical ferment of post-Waterloo Europe. And for the Foggos, the fervid historical political moment of 1819 to 21 in Britain, specifically, with Peterloo, Cato Street, and popular unrest making revolution seem a real possibility. These pictures can equally be related to broad-brush conceptions of romantic interest in heightened pictorial effects and high emotions, and were also entangled in the commercialization and spectacularization of art at this moment, with the rise of entrepreneurial art exhibiting. And here, in a group of newspaper advertisements, we see Parga set alongside exhibitions of John Martin's paintings and of artifacts, animals and people from Lapland, as well as the British Institution show. The venue for Martin's Pompeii and the Lapland exhibition was William Bullock's Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly. This had previously hosted Géricault's Raft of the Medusa and several other massive French academic paintings, including Lethier's Judgment of Brutus and His Sons, which was shown for an extended period from 1814 to 19, Vica's Christ Raising, puffed as the largest oil painting ever executed. And there's a nice installation shot from 1920 which shows it was really big. Right? If you look online, you can see a YouTube video of the picture being wheeled through the gallery a few years ago, and it's quite impressive. It is among these big French paintings that Parga belongs. Here, the biographical context needs filling out. The Foggos, as I've mentioned, are shadowy figures in the literature of 19th century art, but were sufficiently prominent in their own day and in the recent memory of Victorian writers to lead to entries in the Dictionary of National Biography. As opponents of the Royal Academy and active promoters of public access to art and national heritage, they have secured a certain place in recent scholarship on early Victorian cultural politics. More consideration of their lives has appeared only in connection with their father, the London-based Scottish watchmaker and political activist, James Foggo, who led his family into an adventurous life. Fearing arrest for his radical beliefs, in 1799, Foggo escaped with his family to revolutionary France. In Paris, the brothers entered the studio of the history painter, Jean-Baptiste Reynaud, who has been described as, quoting, the last surviving academic talent of the old school. I think quite a famous image on the right, slightly less famous image on the left. They were entered by Reynaud as students of the Post-Revolutionary Academy and remained students of the new École des Beaux-Arts. So although British, they were, artistically, products of the French academic system. James returned to England in 1815. George followed him with their mother in 1819, in which year the elder James Foggo embarked on a journey to Brazil, perhaps on business in relation to his watchmaking, although perhaps also in connection with political activism there. He was not heard of again, and the circumstances in which he disappeared, we don't know, whether it's to do with politics or whether it's just a misfortune, we don't know. In London, George and James Foggo became regular exhibitors. As noted by Samuel Redgrave in his 1874 Dictionary of British Artists, quoting, "The works they produced were chiefly scripture subjects, and from their unusually large dimensions and treatment were hardly of a class to find purchasers. But the two brothers, working harmoniously together for nearly 45 years, followed the bent of their own genius, undeterred by the want of public appreciation, while they found by teaching their chief means of living." In the 1820s, they secured a number of commissions in connection with newly erected churches by virtue of their affiliation with the architect Francis Goodwin. His scheming and hard-nosed business practices drew some negative attention from contemporaries, and the steady allocation of commissions to the Foggos was surely part of this approach. Identifying the brothers' works themselves generally involves squinting at the details of old watercolours and photographs. So here, their altarpiece of the French Protestant Church, demolished in 1888, or here, the pool of Bethesda from one of Goodwin's churches, closed in 1968 and now derelict. The enduring political commitments of the brothers are not in question. The politically conservative painter William Etty, noting their opposition to the Royal Academy, that Etty was a great fan of, referred to them as sons of a Scotch factionnaire, a soldier or guard, who fled his country and took refuge in Paris at an early period of the old French Revolution, and are themselves true chips off the old block. Sketching their careers, Colin Trott sets out how their commitments were clear in their vocal campaigning for public access to art, their criticism of the art establishment, and through their iconography with, quote, the introduction of topics relating to representative sovereignty to create a popular history where liberty is set against the power of the social elite. But theirs was a political practice in more extensive and structural terms. They asserted a collective, or at least insistently collaborative practice, as an alternative to the individualism which was being consolidated as the absolute and exclusive model of creativity at this point, this being the prime feature we dub Romanticism, which has endured to be challenged by, but also survived resiliently beyond, contemporary collaborative and collective curatorial and creative work. So George and James were presented as a unit, although George did exhibit separately as well. While working and living alongside each other would doubtless have been a practical efficiency and helped the brothers endure a hostile marketplace, the Foggos achieved no great celebrity or material success. James Foggo suffered poor mental health and was unable to work by 1859 when he applied successfully for charitable support from the Artists' General Benevolent Institution. He died in 1860. George died in 1869 in debt to a tailor who executed the will, a suggestive detail which, along with the documentation of their crowded living conditions living in Warren Street, one house which had 21 people in it, so the James and George and their families, and then a load of other people as well, points to their social positioning alongside precarious artisans and small traders, a contrast with life just a few streets away in Charlotte Street among the Royal Academicians. We can note in passing, too, that their ally, Francis Goodwin, was the son of a carpenter, and the political commitments, aggressive business practices, and allegiance to established artistic styles and formats arise, I would argue, not inevitably, but probabilistically, out of a classed experience of the art world. This moves us into thinking about the kind of artistic labour manifested here, what investment in time, what expectations were involved. Commenting on Bullock's promotion of big French academic paintings, the art historian Oscar Bachmann noted that there was an explicit emphasis not just on the size of the pictures and the multitudes contained within, but also their moral and aesthetic impact and the duration of their production. Lethier's Brutus was stated to have taken 20 years to produce. Bachmann notes, I'm quoting, the French concept of the masterpiece, the picture which takes a very long time to produce and sort of sums up your abilities, was intended to banish any suspicion of corruption from the exhibition piece and sanction its ultimate destination in a museum. Without state support of the sort that at least some of their French contemporaries enjoyed, and with no national museum of modern art, the Foggos were not able to pursue their laborious efforts without recourse to the open market and a variety of employment. In practice, their multi-hyphenated careers as teachers, lecturers, artists, reproductive printmakers, and arts administrators, and the competitive streak of self-interest apparent in their sharp dealings along with Francis Goodwin in the 1820s, represents an artistic career shaped by market forces. Moreover, they embraced this as a positive position. As cultural critics, the Foggos were dedicated to the principle of a free market for art. It was only because that free market was skewed by aristocratic influence and the undeserved prominence of the Royal Academy and its members that it did not serve the public better, in their view. The tragedy, we might say, was that they dedicated their art and writings to the corrosive effects of cynical modernity, but were incapable of diagnosing their own position effectively. There are paradoxes playing out here. The artists most overt in challenging modernity and working productively within a tradition were vocal advocates for a free market in art that could only in reality disadvantage them, while those artists who were most complicit with the aesthetic of free market individualism, which is not to say they drew advantage from the position themselves in the short term, are those that are today imagined as radicals in art. Turner and Blake come most immediately to mind as artists of acute individualism, prolific productivity and creative efficiency, exemplary so-called romantic artists in those regards. We need to look back at the sociologist Colin Campbell's account of Romanticism and consumerism from the 1980s when it's first published to see the useful assertion that Romanticism provided, unquote, powerful cultural support for the principle of consumer sovereignty in relation to cultural products, a consequence which in reality few of them, the artists, would probably have approved. Which is very obviously the case with Blake. The massive pictures shown by Bullock were statements of faith in the face of a skeptical age. Most obviously, this is the case in their sheer scale and pictorial ambition, but there was a thematic dimension as well. For Vickers' picture insists upon the physical reality of resurrection in the face of, in a British context, a century of official church skepticism, and Lethier's insistence upon the most severe kind of republican political virtue and the most brutal paternal authority restated in the face of political compromise of the post-Napoleonic era was obviously kind of a lost cause. Resurrection, or Republican self-sacrifice were, by this date, equally anachronistic, equally to be viewed as fantasies or self-deluding fallacies in an age of political economy and the globalizing empire of trade. And it was such a miracle, which was the subject of Haydn's notorious Lazarus, also interred at the Pantheon. Without recourse to a miraculous narrative, Parga nonetheless confronts us with the idea of resurrection, of the dead being returned to the world, of not actually to life, exposing submerged or disguised memories. We are invited to observe the dead being brought back before the eyes of their loved ones. This is a picture preoccupied with a shocking juxtaposition of dead with the living, the past and the present, and indeed the future, hence all the children, and that newly married couple to the right. So, in the Foggos, we have politically committed artists, internationalist in their outlook, from a fiercely radical family background, finding the practical means, in a small-scale egalitarian creative brotherhood, of forging an art of the greatest pictorial ambition intended to address, in immediate ways, definite social needs for Christian art, and in the case of Parga, political critique. Given the events of the last few years in Britain and the sense that revolutionary change was a genuine possibility, the Foggos could be encouraged in producing such a massive anti-government political statement in anticipation, this is, optimistic, but in anticipation of a transformed political state where such works might properly become features of, say, a national gallery founded on democratic rather than aristocratic lines. And yet such is not recognised as a possibility even within those strands of Marxist and leftist art history that we might think should properly consider the Foggos as heroes. There has instead been the ongoing pursuit of opposition within the realm of the aesthetic, finding heroes in the figures of Turner or Blake, or most surprisingly of all, that son of an affluent miller and merchant, aspirant gentleman, Constable. And I'm thinking here of Andrew Hemingway, for instance, whose commentary is the most sustained and self-aware analysis of the painter, but who just can't get away from actually liking the pictures and ends up mobilising Adorno to justify his response. The canon of British art, after a half-century of progressive art history, doesn't really look all that different, arguably. It has been augmented rather than overturned by efforts which have generally been additive in nature, getting some women artists into the National Collection, say, or has involved setting up alternative canons that sit separately. And it's worth digging around for some of the reviews of Katie Hessel's History of Art Without Men to see these points being made in a different way, and notably the online essay in the Penitent Review, which is entertainingly blunt. That across the spectrum of political positions and methodologies, we still so often prefer the speed of production of Turner or Blake's instantaneous and autonomous production, romantic inspiration over labour and duration, tells us something. That we still prefer the faux brotherhood of the pre-Raphaelites, middle-class art school kids posing as bohemians to achieve celebrity, to the actual fraternity of the overtly politically committed Foggos, should tell us something important. Now, there were surely some issues with the painting itself. When it was exhibited in Paris in 1840, a critic complained it was a monochrome that was already darkened by London's notorious urban pollution. It's hard to read the action. It's a pretty diffuse composition. One of the longest critical accounts from 1822 complained about the absence of some master group and the cutting up of lights and shadows. The handling of anatomy drew negative comment as well. But such comments should not lead to the deceptive claim that the relationship between success and failure in art can be fully reasoned or considered substantively in terms of pictorial qualities, i.e. the artwork can be detached from the institutions that produce it. More substantively, there was the fact that confronting the British public with such a stark indictment of the government and monarchy was unlikely to win general favour. That it does so through the presentation of corpses and unsettling juxtapositions with the living, including children and that couple, and involving partial nudity, brings into play morbid themes and more than a whiff of necrophilia. unfamiliar in the context of mainstream painting, but all the more acutely so given the historical moment. This was quite precisely the moment of the advent of an industrialized and distancing movement in the handling of the dead, which removed bodies from sight, with urban burial grounds being abandoned and new suburban cemeteries being devised. This was taking place in Paris exactly while the brothers Foggo were growing up there, and it was a growing concern in Britain, leading to the creation of Kensal Green and the great out-of-town cemeteries of London that's preceded by cemeteries elsewhere around the UK. More generally, without the apparatus of a written description, the subject is pretty hard to decipher. An element here is the rather complicated racial and national identities being set forward. The work manifests the nested Orientalism, Militia Bakich Haydn's term, which characterizes Western views of the Balkans. The Pargiots are themselves exoticized figures, at least in terms of their costumes and haircuts and manners. And if later Orientalist pictures generally contrasted Christian Greeks directly with the racialized Oriental figures of Turks, that clarifying potential is not here pursued. The Turk is pretty lost in the crowd, and it would require a fine knowledge of costume to readily distinguish the Suliots to the left, Albanian Christians who had taken refuge in Parga. We are perhaps more sensitive to issues like this now in the wake of work addressing Western perceptions of Southeast European identities in more complex ways, without reducing these to the blunt oppositions of Orientalism. Maria Todorova, notably, traces the forms of racism that developed in the West in relation to the Balkans, which involved themes of complex hybridity and degeneration, a pollution of whatever was left of ancient Greek purity. While the phobic hatred and fear of Islam is loud and clear, who stands in opposition is less clear in this picture. The very novelty of the theme and the artistic dependence upon existing models on other themes aggravates that issue. So disentombment is pictured through figural arrangements signifying Christian entombment or deposition. The picture is really an amalgam of motifs for which we can quite readily spot models. I'm not saying these are the exact models, apart from the Rubens, I think it clearly is. But you can do this sort of source spotting endlessly. And critics did name Rubens as a source for specific figures, the Carracci for the character of the design, and Veronese, surprisingly, Veronese for the colouring, which, it's a bit hard to imagine. But we can go around the picture noting these templates drawn from Old Master and resonant with more recent academic art. So the picture comes across as a collage of Christs and prophets, but that's how such pictures work. We need, ultimately, I think, to move outside an art historical assessment to gain entry to the historical potential of this painting. In practical terms, it means practicing an historical sociology, which, as Bourdieu posits, is concerned with the recovery of dead possibilities, alter histories that undermine the sense of destiny that the actual historical record provides. What a world we would live in if it was the Foggos, or not Turner and Blake and Constable and the Pre-Raphaelites and the Impressionists that we venerated in our art museums. But that in turn points to the art historical doxa, which requires that art history is concerned with the visual and therefore the already visible. Parga is a monumental statement on behalf of the losing side in art history, extinguished and invisible, which may be the best reason to give it attention. Rather than dwelling further on that thought, my very final comments concern a further move outside of art historical or even historical evaluation into the field of, deep breath, moral virtue. For moral critics of modernity, the baleful influence of capitalism is never more shocking, never more of an affront to basic humanity than in the abject disregard for the dead fostered under its reign. Resurrectionists treating the dead as mere commodity, the unfeeling slave trader throwing the dead overboard, the terror of the gas chamber provide key images exposing the dehumanizing brutality of the modern age. In an oblique commentary on ghosts appended to their seminal dialect of enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer distilled from this a pessimistic lesson for the historian. Modernity, they observe, is insistently concerned with wiping away the sense of transgenerational or transhistorical identification which might survive within traditions. From this unfolds a complex of psychological and cultural forces determined to mark a break between present and past, between the son and the father, the vigorous and the exhausted, the relevant and the redundant, the free and the burdened. Adorno and Horkheimer assert only the conscious horror of destruction creates the correct relationship with the dead. They add, in a point relevant to the theme of forced migration in the picture of Parga, the well-meaning of threatening advice frequently given to emigrants to forget all their past because it cannot be transferred. The Pargiots in Foggo's picture are tragically compelled to enact this elimination of the past as they obliterate the physical remains of their ancestors, but at least demonstrate their unease rather than remain impassive. The Foggos, for their part, are raising our consciousness of that destruction. The Pargiots are shown compelled to a bleak act of destruction, but aimed at preserving rather than erasing the memory of their ancestors. Such a rejection of the necessity to forget and live in the moment conforms to Western Balkanism, which Todorova traces, resurfacing in present-day accounts of conflict and war in the region, supposedly underpinned by ancient rivalries which ought to be forgotten. So these are kind of cast as primitive people who are not letting go of the past in the way that they should do if they were modern and Western. The Foggos were moved to a grandiose act of creation on the same principle, raising consciousness of that erasure, although doing so by mobilizing an image of the Pargiots which exhibits that imputed ambiguity and in-betweenness, incomplete other, which characterizes Western views of the Balkans. These are, perhaps, in David Scott's term used in relation to anti-colonialism, conscripts of modernity, compelled to mimic and utilize features of the modernity which actually damns and threatens to destroy them. In Scott's advice, referring to, I'm quoting, the bleak face of the modernities constructed by the post-colonial state, we ought perhaps to be less enthusiastic about the heroic story embodied in the alternative modernities thesis, and more concerned to inquire into the modern concepts and institutions upon which these resisting projects themselves depended. While it is the case that the Foggo, with later pictures and writings, criticized colonialism more directly, they were not against modernity, as were the more familiar figures we associate with the Romanticism who could afford to indulge a vision of the old world, which they were quite definitely not part of, literally afford. Look at the middle-class backgrounds of so many of the proponents of that anti-modernism, from Samuel Palmer to Ruskin and Morris, which is not to reduce that outlook to a class perspective, but to acknowledge the probabilistic role of class experience in the formation of such thinking. The Foggos instead stake a claim to continuity rather than return, continuity within pictorial tradition, in relation to political liberties that are or should be unceasing over history, sort of reaching back to Magna Carta and Wat Tyler and the Peasants' Revolt, and are only interrupted by contingent and specific circumstances of the modern age. It requires a kind of moral orientation, one that risks being gauche and excessively earnest in the context of art history, a field where it is necessary to adopt a position of sanguine detachment in pretty well everything apart from aesthetic and emotional content, in which matters there is the corresponding duty to be always full of limitless interest and always full of measured passion. We will always be judgmental in matters of taste and value. We will never judge in matters of moral virtue, which disposition betrays and embodies the class basis of our discipline. We need some different disciplinary framework, some different sense of purpose to be able to consider productively a picture which was seeking actively to ascertain, against the odds and in the face of state violence and cultural degeneration, and perhaps partly also for commercial purposes, the correct relationship with the dead. Okay, thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Martin, for this really incredible, not just insight into this particular painting, but really a real rethinking of art history's doxa, as you put it. I do have a question while everyone kind of gets their questions ready in the room. So I was really convinced by everything you said, but I think particularly struck by this moment or a little glimpse of speculative history or speculation that you opened up for us, in the sense of what would art history be if it was Foggo, that were the Foggos that were in all the museums instead of the Turners and the Constables and so on. And again, also thinking of that in relation to global revolutions and a kind of broader moral sense of the contemporary moment then, but also what it would mean for the discipline, what it would mean also for museum goers, not necessarily the discipline, and would that then involve a very different sort of politics as well. So on the one hand, we're thinking about art history and the way it might have evolved. I'm really kind of going with your speculative window, but then also in the day-to-day, like the value and use of the museum. And I wondered if you wanted to speak to some of this more broadly, and also if there were any other Foggo paintings that you might want, because I was really curious about other things they were producing and how that sort of fed into things you were thinking about as well.
Okay, well, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is I don't think it's actually going to happen. And but actually indulging, indulging that kind of possibility, which of course is something which surfaces in various kind of lines of thought. And even if you don't actually imagine some alternative, some transformation, then revealing the thought of those alternatives, which could have been, overcomes, I mean, support Geo, isn't it? Kind of refers to the destiny effect, the idea that when you walk into a museum, the pictures that are there were almost inevitably going to be there because of some intrinsic value to those works, or you can modulate that a bit, but ultimately there is that sense that it's destiny which has brought those things there. And how you overcome that, I think, is a challenge for any kind of institutional working, whether it's disciplinary or whether it's within a museum or a gallery. And I say it's not going to happen, but you can start asking those questions, and asking those questions in a way which is not about extending or supplementing what you have, but actually digging into, well, how did those pictures get there, and what was the alternative? Now, and it would be tempting, I guess, usually the task of historical recovery is about finding pictures which have been lost or forgotten, and that's obviously this moment. That's a lot around women artists and getting those artists into the collections, or recovering artists that have been marginalised and bringing them back. Beyond that, I mean, are you actually entertaining those possible different histories sufficiently if you still need to find the pictures? Now, this is the one case where you do have a visual record, so it's undoing my own argument. But the bulk of the rest of the pictures, we have no record for at all, other than those tiny kind of visual records. There's a few prints, but there are documentary records. So it is possible to build a record of the other things that the Foggos were doing. It's pictures of the French Revolution. It was Wat Tyler and the Peasants' Revolt. There's pictures relating to the 1848 revolutions. So there's a whole kind of body. It's like, well, imagine what would that look like? And to ask the question of, we're unlikely to find them until one of our friends in the commercial world finds them in an attic somewhere, and even then, I don't think it's not going to sell, is it? So if you're dealing with that complete absence and that probable kind of impossibility of recovery, nonetheless, can you still pursue that history? But to pursue that history, can you do that through art history? And probably not.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was just thinking in terms of histories of art history, conventional late 18th into early 19th century is neoclassicism, then Romanticism. But this picture, I mean, you pointed out, I mean, people pointed out the Rubens link. But what it seems is a forgotten moment, which is the seriousness of the Baroque revival at this point. I mean, it actually reminds me, the pyres really remind me of David's very early painting of scenes from the Iliad, which is also a great big pyre. And he's looking at artists like Durameau and Doyen. I don't know if they were on view at the Louvre and the Foggos could have seen them. But it seems to me that whole element, and also the way that you've got these dispersed centres of interest, is very much part of that Baroque revival. So that's just another small footnote to the different kinds of stories you could use this picture to tell.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's attempting a kind of academic synthesis of multiple sources and styles, and I kind of ran through the reference points, which is, I thought, kind of the master, the master model is probably the Karachi, that there's that, that kind of commitment to academic figure drawing, but there's also the interesting colour and the dynamism of composition. So.
It's really the bottoms of people's feet that are so obvious here, which is something, I think it's Durameau. There are some very strange, awkward, and I'm just wondering if the sheer sort of oddity of it. I'm just wondering if you could have seen those pictures.
Yeah.
Martin, with no extant, and I really hate to ask you this painting, with no extant paintings and I presume no drawings and a few engravings, we really don't know how, and I missed the first 2 minutes, so maybe are they autodidact or did they?
No, they were trained with the French academic system.
I'm sorry, I missed that before I came in. I mean, we really don't know how good they are. I mean, anybody being cited next to Benjamin Robert Hayden, he's going to. I mean, these pictures could really frighten the children, couldn't they? I mean, they could be really, really bad. Yeah. Isn't that is? I presume you have thought long and hard about that.
I think it's very possible, and even likely. But the question I'm suggesting we might focus on is, why does that question matter?
Yeah, I did notice.
Yeah. David?
Just curious. I mean, you put this picture in a particular moment, which is between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and after the kind of crisis of 1819 and leading up, presumably, to the Reform Bill. And it seems that at this point it was possible to imagine that there would be a public for this picture. Is there any sense from, is in terms of the initial response, is there any, maybe, you wouldn't, is there any evidence at all of there being a positive response to this?
In 1822, it's a mixed response. There are people criticising it on formal grounds, but actually quite lengthy magazine reviews and newspaper reviews. Some of which, of course, you have to suspect. Well, who's writing it, and is it just a fix? But I think this extent of commentary is sufficient to suggest that people were at least intrigued and challenged by the picture, the Foggos do have some presence in the art world, even by this point, and certainly later on. They are the select committee, and they are kind of players within, which is what Colin Trott kind of details. They are players within an art world which is, contesting what the public should be and what the National Gallery should be doing and what the Royal Gallery be doing. So they are players, and as I say, the Dictionary of National Biography is a really kind of odd source when you look at what artists are covered in there. Right? John Wood, another favourite artist of mine, gives quite a decent entry in the Dictionary of National Biography. Nobody's heard of him now, right? The Foggos get an entry, so there's and that's to do with the recent memory that it had. But they were definitely visible, and the fact that the painting, shipping that painting over to Paris in 1840, they had to have some resource to do that. Showing it in the international exhibition, I haven't found, I think, any lengthy commentary on it in 1862, But the theme of Parga does continue as a reference point, right through later into the 19th century. Particularly, it's kept alive in relation to Italian patriotism and the kind of drive towards a kind of reform of Italy. But Parga gets a reference point there, and there's a kind of literary references to it later on. So, yeah, I think there probably was interest. The problem is, if you have a free exhibition in the Pantheon, and everybody knows it's this kind of weird place that you go to after you've had your ginger beer and buns, that's not necessarily a great venue for it. And the brothers are making a problem of themselves in relation to the art world, so they don't have the kind of official acclaim that might underpin the possibility of a picture like this being taken more seriously or seen more extensively.
So does that suggest then that this, in a sense, this alternative history or destiny, that there was more that there was a time when that possibility was kept alive?
Yeah, and which kind of Ford Madox Brown and Todd's account is a kind of continuation of that. I think there is a way that you can think about later 19th century painting, which is aimed towards a kind of democratic cause and a public, but that isn't necessarily the kind of the mainstream of a familiar art history. But certainly, the pictures don't survive, but the record is there for a significant body of works that the Foggos produced and kept exhibiting year on year.
It's really interesting. We have quite a few questions online as well, but we'll take one more in the room and then get to the online ones.
Thanks very much for this talk. Actually, I disagree about this being a bad painting. I think it's a pretty interesting. We can't tell about the painting.
I'd say it's no worse than what you'll see in loads of Musée des Beaux-Arts and town halls across Europe. I'd say that, yeah.
Yes. But I think there's several very interesting things about it. One is that sort of epic ambition it has, which is shared, as you pointed out, with quite a few paintings of this moment. Particularly in France, it's very evident with what was doing in the late teens and early 1820s. And the other thing is, I was just sort of thinking of it in relation to the Raft of the Medusa and its politics. This really has an explicit political sting in the tail. Because the Raft of the Medusa, you don't realize it relates to contemporary politics until you read about it. But with this one, you notice these British guys at the back and you wonder what's going on. And it really enacts the full range of the politics. This is a sort of, something like the massacre at Chios, some horror, but it's also British betrayal. And it's a sort of intriguing, it has a really intriguing complexity and sort of epic ambition. Now, whether how far it achieves it, but then if one thinks, following people like Franco Moretti, that the epic in the 19th century is a failed epic, this may be an interesting example of a kind of failed epic. And then there's the further question of why art accommodated this kind of production in this particular moment. What was it about the sort of radical liberal imaginary which gave rise to works like this? So I think this is a painting that's got a lot to offer.
Yeah, no, I think, the point about the explicitness, it's a detail, but it is a detail that you can find, and it's pointed out. The explicitness that the bad guys are the British. Yes. I think I'm right in interpreting there are dots on the hills in the extreme distance. They are presumably Ali Pasha and these invading Muslim forces. But they're not even figures, they're dots. They're really just kind of dots. And you could imagine a different picture again, which would have kind of gone the Delacroix route, where there would have been loathsome Turks looking over the city walls and, that immediate kind of sexual threat. And that's generally not here apart from that Turkish agent. So it's, it is unusual. There's clearly a kind of racial politics underlying this, but it's not as lucid as it could have been to get a cheap shot. And it's the British who are singled out for criticism.
I think also it is the way there's a sort of very explicit contemporary reference, because things like the Massacre at Chios sort of get absorbed in a general orientalizing fantasy. This has that in the foreground, which you think this ties up with any number of biblical paintings and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But then there's these men in top hats
Yeah.
at the back.
Yeah.
Well, you know, so
Yeah.
it's interesting. Not in top hats. No, top hats.
Martin, thank you so much. I was wondering if you'd thought a little bit about the sky and the buildings. The architecture is really, really interesting. And going back to your point about the bad guys versus the good guys, what's fascinating is that there's a sliver of the moon above, and there's the cross. And I don't know if I'm misreading this, but that's the reverse of a crescent moon. And the crescent moon is also a symbol of the Ottoman flag.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's a very delicate, very subtle, but
Yeah.
clear quote
Yeah.
of some sort, because it is the reverse of the crescent moon
Yeah.
versus the cross. So one is that. But the architecture itself seems to dissolve.
Yeah.
The pyre merges quite magically with the sky.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you've thought about the idea of a graveyard, because mausolea are very similar to what is shown, especially in the background, right? These thick, big walls. So in terms of the built environment, it's a very interesting staging happening here. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the detail of the moon at all. Actually, the cross, which is you can work out, it's kind of topping the pediment of the. So you realise it's a church. It's named as a church in the pamphlet. That took me quite a while to spot, actually. I think the sky. There clearly is quite a lot of sky, and it is ambiguous whether it's smoke rising from the pyre or whether it's a stormy sky and therefore a kind of, a scene-setting thing. So yeah, I'm sure. I'd have to check whether there's any reference to that in the Foggo's commentary, but I'm sure we could envisage a detail like that playing a part. And the cross being obscured by smoke, it's clearly, that alone, even without the potential of the moon, the symbolism of the moon, that alone is about, hope and Christian hope being hidden or overcome by dark forces. So no, it's an interesting thing to think about more.
We have two questions online. They're quite different, so I'll ask one and then answer, then go to the next one. So thanks very much. I'm struck by your comparison of the Parga to Lethier's Brutus. I've previously thought about Lethier's Death of Virginia, initially conceived of as belonging in a series with the Brutus, as participating in similar strategies like Delacroix's depictions of the Greek Revolution, in Massacre of Chios in Greece, on the ruins of Missolonghi, through metaphors like, very long sentence, like, as you note in the Parga, killing one's family members as a preventative measure against slavery by the Ottomans. Okay, so could you please speak more to how British and French romantic attitudes towards this revolution diverge or converge, or perhaps play any formative role? No. This revolution may have played. So, is there any formative role this revolution may have played in Romanticism? Is the question. Yeah.
I don't know. I've got much more to add to that specific point, but I did gesture, and it's something which I think we ought to think about more, and I think it's not been thought about enough, which is the more general theme of the liberal revolutions of the 1820s and 1830s in relation to, British art, because that's what we do here, within literature, there's a certain amount because of Byron, most clearly, and the Greek War of Independence. But in the visual arts, I can't think that there's a kind of body of work on this. And that's, I think there's a couple of factors which come into play there. One of which is, as I say, there's the focus on landscape, on genre painting, on Turner and on Constable, and that's what's important in British art in the 1820s and 1830s. That's one thing to think about. The other thing is that where, insofar as we've concerned ourselves with themes of kind of empire and social change, it's been focused on plantation slavery on the Caribbean and on India, and quite rightly so. But I've become intrigued, partly because of Foggo Elder going off to Brazil and disappearing when there's a revolution, going, well, this is a whole other kind of set of connections. And when you read about the kind of informal empire that Britain was forging in the 1820s and 30s through commercial interference and diplomacy, it reads a lot more like, the kind of heart and neck idea of empire, which is mediated by media and by kind of social and cultural influence. So it feels like there is something to explore there, but I'm not sure that I'm equipped to do it. But it feels like a theme which is worth more attention. And it probably means paying attention or giving more attention to pictures which either don't exist or which haven't been given much attention, but in comparison to the kind of landscape and genre painting of the same period. I mean, France, obviously it's much more central, and the literature that there is on Greek Wars of Independence or Greek Revolution and visual arts has focused on the French situation, partly because they're more conventionally successful artworks and it's some big names, so it's a different story which is played out there.
Yeah, thank you. Hope that was helpful. There's another one, a more provocative one. Can you discuss what you meant by the enjoyment of a work of art despite its use as a critical object, especially in regards to Essay on Constable by Andrew Hemingway? Art historians not permitted to enjoy the objects discussed, and under what conditions? Not finished yet. Under what conditions are they in fact supposed to do so?
Yeah. I would observe this as a kind of a characteristic of our discipline that, and I find this a bit kind of awkward actually sometimes, that you can be thoroughly committed to all sorts of forms of social critique and a kind of politicization, yet people still like the pictures. And I think that almost that necessity, I don't think of, that the aesthetic response remains the foundation for an art historical understanding. Now, you can do other kinds of art historically inflected work, but you end up being told, oh, well, that's not art history, that's something else, Or, the kinds of work that you can do as an art historian, but which are based upon documentary biographical sources and which don't actually deal with the pictures. But the expectation, which is insistent, is that the experience of pleasure and the engagement with the work of art is the foundation and the starting point for analysis, however critical that analysis might be. And allied to that is a very persistent notion that complex works of art are, or complex, sophisticated, and visually pleasing works of art are better historical evidence than simple, ugly, confined or limited pictures. And that, I suppose, thinking even of the way in which, obviously, there's a lot of advocacy for art history as a discipline and making sure it's in schools. It's always kind of founded on the idea of visual literacy, and visual literacy involving elements of individual response. And this is a kind of underlying mythology around art, is that everybody can enjoy art. If you've got eyes, then everybody can enjoy it. And that's a nice idea in some ways, but in other ways, well, you're already kind of preempting and working towards some kinds of artwork than others. But
and this is me speaking rather than the person who asked the question, but it is really interesting also to think about when we're thinking about the visual more broadly and not just an artwork, and also thinking now in terms of how your response to something like an Instagram image or a TikTok image or whatever it is, there is that, it draws you in, and there is a there is an immediate response as well, and whether it's artistic or kind of an advert or something that is meant to draw you in different ways. I think it is quite helpful to think about what it means, what your sort of relationship to the aesthetic object is in relation to the criticality produced by it, or sometimes not. So we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Martin. That was really very, very rich. I wonder if you can say something about how the picture is ineffective. That is, the Foggos have an axe to grind. They have something they want to say. How well do you think? So it's a sort of the relationship between a political subject matter and, let's say, it's not just style or aesthetics, let's call it a visual strategy or visual rhetoric. And if you could have gone back and whispered in their ears, would you have, George, James? I wouldn't necessarily be quite so overt. in sort of the chain of lightened figures that arrow up to the top, to the apex figure, I wouldn't make this so. I mean, do you find it ineffective in some way? And that's kind of traditional art history talking.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure I'd want to give them any advice. I think they were doing okay in their way. And actually, going back to that point of, you know, what was the commentary like? I mean, you can take yourself out of this and say, well, what was the commentary like? And the commentary, there was a lot of positive commentary. They did get the story. They would. I mean, sometimes you get the sense that they're copying things out from the pamphlet when they're reviewing the picture in order to understand what's going on. But then that does lead to the question of if we're asking, well, what would we want the Foggos to have done to make this picture more effective? Then it also leads to the question, well, what do we think makes an effective picture? And that would probably take us back to to a suggestion, which, do you need a pamphlet to understand what this picture is about? And if you do, then somehow it's failing as a picture, arguably, right? Well, that means that there's a preconception of what an artwork does, and it is primarily visual, and it's, you know, founded in a personal aesthetic experience. I mean, you could say, I mean, it's the sort of Duchamp visual and non-visual elements of the work of art, that actually the non-visual elements are perfectly legitimate. And for a kind of painting which is didactic and politically engaged and directed towards the public sphere rather than private consumption, needing a booklet in order to, you know, have a key in effect through the painting, maybe that's not a bad thing, or maybe that doesn't have to be a problem.
It makes it more of a literary experience. In other words, I mean, some old Italian paintings would have actually written on the painting, you know, this is what's going on here and this is what's going on there. So you read your way through the picture, but that's kind of a modernist complaint.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I think part of the visual language here is absolutely, well, some of it's quite macabre, but some is absolutely the sentimental, because you have a mother and child, you have a father and an aged father and a daughter, and you have very centrally and of interest to me, as far as I can see, a blind man with a small child who is the guide, which all of these are absolutely quintessential tropes of sentimentalism, including in its neoclassical version with things like David's Belisarius. So there's that rhetoric, which is very fundamental to it, along with an ethnographic one, along with, you know, the Greek, along with a kind of, as you say, a religious one to do with martyrdom. So it's more that it's a kind of palimpsest of a whole different range of rhetorics which are fused in, we could say, perhaps not entirely successful ways, but I think in a very conscious and deliberate way, that's what they're aiming to do. Yeah. You might dispute that it's a worthwhile thing to do, but I think they know what they're doing.
Yeah, no, it is a compendium of motifs. And, you know, remind ourselves again that these are two people who made this painting, right? And announced as two people, as equal partners. So it is a kind of collective product, and a collective product requires some sort of common ground. It's not a personal vision of the world. Yeah. It's already, I mean, even if they're brothers and they're close and they live together, you know, then there are two units, two human beings involved in that, and that is already pointing towards a kind of collective a sense of the aesthetic or the pictorial.
Thanks so much for that. I really enjoyed it. I was really interested in the idea of, in the face of state violence, what is the relationship to the dead, and also what would it mean to change the framework of what makes a picture museum worthy. I think that these questions, and also like, what does it perhaps matter if the work is bad? Is it perhaps more important that the kind of conversation it can start? Is like, these are really interesting ways to start to think about unpacking this. And for me, reflecting on that, I really found that one of the questions the work is asking, even though it's pastiche of many other things that have been said before, is what can we take with us? And that seems to be a very contemporary question in terms of civil war, potential of civil war, environmental catastrophe. And if on the left-hand side you see the cross, but it's actually mirrored in the picture, which is a religious painting, which has also got the cross, which is being moved. And so it feels like the answer, what could we take with us? We take our dead, we could take our religions, and maybe even art is central to this. So I think this is a very contemporary question, and I think it's really exciting to think, not worry about how beautiful it is or how moving it is, but really think about what is the question here, and how could that apply to today? And I think that's, in that sense, it's absolutely like right there, right now. And the idea of looking back for a collaborative work as well, to open up this kind of question, take you all kinds of different places.
Well, and thank you for that. And I mean, I didn't sort of over-egg it, I hope, but there's doubtless that my own thinking about this picture has been, or continues to be, shaped by seeing what's happening in kind of curatorial and creative practice around collaborative practice and collective practice, and even the way kind of figurative painting is resurfacing and has a presence. So there's that, and then there's the political resonances of the theme. I mean, I've been looking at this picture for a few years, but obviously it's come more sharply into focus. The idea of not handing the Pargots over to the Turks, just kind of leaving them to themselves. Well, that obviously speaks to the moment in a almost uncannily kind of direct way. So thank you.
We have a small, I think more of a comment rather than a question, but I'll do that, and then we'll have one last question. Thank you, very, very interesting talk. 1822, year Ali Pasha dies. This painting is right on the moment of contemporary events of the Greek Revolution, which has started the previous year. Ali Pasha was notoriously famous in Britain as well, and there were plays the same year, the Theatre Royal in London. I think the picture's out there before Ali Pasha's death, and of course, I'm trying to kind of work through the history of this. It's quite complicated because there's conflict between Ali Pasha, who identifies as Albanian and identifies his territories as Albania, and the Ottoman Empire, and there's conflict there as well, which is again is the sort of nested Orientalisms, that there's stories within stories which need to be unpicked. I can't recall commentary about this picture that relates it directly to what's actually happening in 1822 in the region, but it might be out there and I've not seen it, and I think it's just the dates don't quite kind of connect up, but no, it'd be interesting to think about more.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin. I've really enjoyed not only your paper, but listening to all the questions and the conversation, and that call for complexity and an art history that can deal with difficulty or aversion, repulsion, other kinds of response to works, as well as kind of being called in to think, more complexly about a work of art. So it's been, the whole conversation's been enjoyable, and we don't get to do this very often as colleagues. We've been, head down in grant making today, so it's really nice actually just to think together. So I'm going to say I really enjoyed that. But my question was, I was just thinking about your call for an art history that can deal with a more expansive visual record, and as I was looking at sort of beyond the great names and particularly in art history that deals primarily with painting and the framed object or the exhibition object. And as I was looking at the lithograph in 1842, for me, I was thinking about, 1842 as well as the Illustrated London News is founded in that year, and thinking about the kind of visual record that can take into account a kind of a print media that sits parallel, it's not a separate thing, or again, makers who are working between media as well. And I think we still struggle with that. And we had a seminar here last week, didn't we, about female engravers. And I think some of the, again, we're still so specialised in our own art histories that we fail to, I think, account for the messiness of the visual record. Not the messiness, just the complexity of the visual record, where a lot of artists, and a lot of these artists who are correspondents and reporters for papers and pamphlets are often those names that, you're like S. Smith, who's that? But I think that, that kind of landscape that still, for me, seems to need mapping and can deal with those figures in just a more expanded way of image making, and especially I think the mid-19th century is probably an interesting moment to do that.
Yeah. And I suppose I'd say, although I didn't necessarily spell it out, most of what I was saying about canonicity and the canon actually is about painting, because painting involves notions of authorship and authority, more so even than arts, which you think of as immediately adjacent. I mean, sculpture is the obvious one, and you know, over the years, the way sculpture has been brought back into play in 18th, 19th century art history, you change the story because there are different systems of value around that, and then there's architecture beyond that, and obviously print would be part of that as well. But I suppose I'd say yes to this sense of an expanded field of materials that you can deal with. Whether those materials need to exist and be visible to you is a question, whether there's ways of dealing with materials which aren't invisible, and that's when things like lists and directories, and you know, there's a universal, you know, kind of union lists of prints published in the 19th century. What happens if you start to analyse that rather than the prints which are preserved in the British Museum? I mean, so there's that, and also the question of whether that expanded field leads us away from the canon in the National Gallery or the Tate or wherever, and it might leave that untouched. I mean, how do you actually return to the question of, you know, how value is created within the institutions that we, you know, that exist and we work with and are here, rather than just taking our story somewhere else and saying, well, we want to tell this story over here in the print room or in the in relation to a kind of marginalised material which remains marginal because it's still not there within the institutions.
Thank you so much. I know that we probably have other questions and thoughts, but we will continue next door over drinks. And just to say a very big thank you to Martin for making us really think again about through one picture.
And thank you for the conversation and questions. Thank you.